Barbara?
I have just started recording.
Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us today at our seminar on social reproduction. We're really delighted today to welcome two wonderful speakers, Professor Beth Goldblatt, who is a professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia, and Professor Shireen Hasim, who is Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. And they're going to be speaking about something that's quite crucial to the literature on social reproduction theory increasingly, which is the relationship between social reproduction and climate justice. And it's a theme that we haven't really addressed very much in the past, and but we think it's quite crucial. So we're really looking forward to their presentation today and it's titled Grass in the Cracks, Gender, Social Reproduction and Climate Justice in the Xolobeni struggle. So over to you, Beth and Shireen.
Thanks so much, Prabha. Thank you for giving us the space to talk about our work. Although I'm based in Canada, or at least my paid job is in Canada, I'm currently in a reserve outside of Johannesburg, the cradle of humankind. And Beth is speaking from Sydney, Australia. Unceded Gadigal land. So, here we are in cyberspace. Thank you. While I speak, Beth is going to share some slides which will give you a sense of the area we're talking about in the first couple of slides, and then we'll give you we'll also share some pictures taken by photographer Tom Pierce of the activism that is at the heart of this case that we want to discuss with you. The work we're going to talk about is a chapter in an edited collection, which was itself quite groundbreaking in the sense that it tried to bring together very big literatures and try to get them to speak to each other. Climate change, gender equality and rights, climate justice, and then we ourselves wanted to bring into that conversation notions of social reproduction. So what we have here is a kind of attempt to do that. I'll just set the stage for you, and then Beth will tell you more about the case itself. So if we could just flip that slide, please. This is the area. This is completely to hook you into the beauty of the Wild Coast. This is what the area that is being currently proposed for mining looks like. It's being proposed for mining of titanium. We're speaking about a struggle that is one strand of which is took place through litigation. And the case we want to center in our discussion is the case brought by someone called Duduzile Baleni, who was a headwoman from this area known as Xolobeni. It's a part of the Wild Coast of South Africa on the sort of east, the bottommost east coast of South Africa. So Duduzile Baleni, the head woman, was the first applicant in a case that was brought by the whole community, by members of the community. It was a case against the South African government as well as against an Australian mining company, Qualco, TCM mining, which were the Australian mining company wanted to begin to mine titanium and other minerals in an open cast mine over considerable span of territory, 900 hectares, which is currently occupied by the Xolobeni community. That case which went to the High Court, found that the mining rights couldn't be granted to even though the government wanted to give that mining rights to the Australian company, that they couldn't be granted without the agreement of the community living there. And then that decision has also gone to appeal. What is interesting about this case is that the mining plan, obviously, communities are not homogeneous, united entities with one set of interests. So this mining plan has caused enormous conflict within the community, between the community and the provincial government, between the community and the central government, between elements of the provincial government and elements of the central government. And it has been one of those die-hard activist cases in which the activists have been prepared to risk their lives to try and defend this territory from the degradation that would come from the mining. And if we could just see the next slide, you'll see why this is so important to them. This is a slide from the West Coast, where the same company, West Coast of the country, near Namibia, where the same company has already engaged in coastal mining. And you can see the degradation, the absolute impact of that extractive process on people's homeland, on the area in which they live, and they grow their own food and sustain themselves. So you can see kind of why there's such fierce opposition to this. But we also think that the paper, that this case, we want to talk to you about the ways in which this opposition highlights the links between environmental justice struggles and feminist efforts to overcome the gendered structures of production and reproduction underpinning capitalism. We think that part has been under-thought about, under-theorized, and not foregrounded enough in the ways in which the struggle has been articulated by the activists, but that it's embedded in the struggle. We think you can see it in what particularly the women activists are trying to do. We're using the work of Silvia Federici, which I'm sure is familiar to many people. Federici shows us so clearly how gender, social reproduction, and the resistance to the enclosure of the commons work, right? And helps us to see this link between gender and anti-capitalist struggles as happening simultaneously, if not always articulated as connected. We think that the struggles against mining are a particular and very urgently needed intervention to halt and hopefully reverse, but certainly to try and halt the pernicious effects of neoliberalism, which in this part of the world have seen the privatization and marketization of all these aspects of human and non-human life that are creating climate disasters all over the world. We know that gender is a central structuring force within capitalism, that resistance to mining, we think, can therefore also be framed as resistance to the exploitation of women's reproductive labor. And we use Federici's gendered framing of the commons to try and tease out what we think are the long-term key tensions in this opposition to mining in Xolobeni. The involvement of women as the main producers of food, women positioning themselves as the custodians of the conditions for the reproduction of food, women's movement to the center of the struggle in the context of violence against activists. Several activists and several leaders have been killed in the struggle over the years. And women's assertion of new forms of temporality that kind of put at the center this idea of the responsibilities to future generations, which I do think we see in other climate change struggles, certainly in Canada. I see it very much in the indigenous struggles, the idea of 7 generations of responsibilities looping back of time. The title of our paper really is indebted to Silvia Federici, who, is trying to grasp the contemporary moment of anxiety and panic. Sorry, there's a fly near me. Anxiety and panic. She says, and to quote her, that the very sense that we are living at the edge of a volcano makes it even more crucial to realize that in the midst of so much destruction, another world is growing like grass in the cracks of the urban pavement, challenging the hegemony of capital and state and affirming our interdependence and capacity for cooperation. And so for us, this is also the struggle, this Xolobeni struggle in a context in South Africa of very much feeling like we're living on the edge of a volcano, is a space of hope. It's an articulation of the possibility that destructive, extractivist, patriarchal capitalism might be halted, and that right struggles, in fact, can fruitfully be brought into the struggles to achieve climate justice. We use Mary Mellor. We draw on Mary Mellor to point to sufficiency provisioning as being at the heart of this relationship between productive and reproductive labor. So in challenging extractivist capitalism, which after all is a central contributor to climate harm, the climate justice movement questions the core ideas underpinning the system, that the Earth's resources can be squandered without thought of the future, that enclosure of the land and destruction of communal custodianship has to be achieved, is required in the pursuit of profit and progress, and of course the role of the capitalist state as a central facilitator of those goals. Now, this area that we are talking about has a long history of community resistance to the mining license. Xolobeni is an area that lies on communal land, which is land that is in effect, and I won't go into the detail of the colonial histories that produced the situation, but the communal land has already, in a sense, been enclosed in that it is nominally held by the state. It is designated in practice as customary land that is governed by traditional leaders. The occupants of that land hold something called a permission to occupy certificate. They have secure tenure in this area as a result of the permission to occupy certificate. It's an amazing area. You saw that in the first 2 photographs. It's the second richest botanical reserve in South Africa. That biodiversity and richness is very central to food security. The attempt to mine it goes all the way back to just about 10 years, 12 years after the end of apartheid, when an Australian mining company, Mineral Resources Commodities, was given a license to mine the mineral sands. And even at that point, the process of awarding the license was considered to be very suspicious by the activists. Suspicious in terms of both whether a proper public consultation process had been conducted. By the way, public consultation is very much part of the South African Constitution and its legislative frameworks for policy making. But also, there were huge questions raised over the environmental impact assessments that were done. Who did them? How well were they done? Between 2002 and 2018, at least 12 opponents of the mining in this area have been murdered, all unresolved cases. So this is a violently defended the mining company and the government and their agents, whoever they are defending their right to override the community, often through violent means. Women, given the history of migration in South Africa, women are generally the stalwarts of rural areas. Men historically have moved for jobs in mining and in agribusiness. So women are really the central occupants of these rural areas. And their economic and social roles are over time very clearly recognized. During the apartheid period, they retained the idea of home for migrant workers, but they also produced the food that allowed communities to survive. But while that's been recognized, there is also a long-standing legal battle between rural women and the state in relation to what kind of governance mechanisms would be put in place after 1994 to ensure that women have the rights that are accorded in the Constitution in a substantial and meaningful way. That is the right to really determine how governance takes place in these areas that are so centrally part of women's lives. In the struggle, what we see are very conflicting visions of development, conflicting ideas about mining and its potential, economic potential, and conflicting versions of what constitutes a good life. On the one side, you have government very indebted to the mining-led model of economic development, which is what built the South African economy, for better or for worse, since the minerals revolutions of the 1860s and 1880s. And government thinking that the importance of these minerals, such as titanium, in the new technologies globally will give the country a chance to develop. So it's keen to turn the people of Xolobeni into wage workers, to move them away from being farmers and fisher people, and to kind of do what happened before, which is, enclose the land, create a working class, but as we know, increasingly a working class that is precarious, that are the jobs that are precarious. So it's very much a kind of, as Jackie Cox says, an environmental imaginary that is centered on economic growth, and where the relationship to nature is understood, as she puts it, as a store of resources for growth rather than as common riches, as the natural resources through which we can meet social needs. So that's the hegemonic imaginary of the state. On the other side, you have groups of people living in this area who are not so convinced that development is necessary, nor are they so convinced of the narrative that they are poor and that development will give them some better life, right? So we quote a community leader who says, we don't need outsiders to tell us we are poor. We are not poor. Not a single person in Xolobeni goes to bed hungry. We get fish, we get crayfish and mussels from the sea. We plant vegetables in this beautiful and fertile soil of ours. We are happy with this way of life, and we feel it is an insult to suggest we are poor. So they sort of also here you can see competing versions of the good life. What's interesting is how the law becomes part of the resources that are then used by all of these competing agency or competing groups in order to get what they want, right? So there have been legal successes for the community, which had dealt very significant blows to the state and to the companies involved in these mining rights applications. We think these are also internationally significant victories. But really what we want to talk about specifically today is how the applicant, Dudu Baleni, and the community, she's first applicant for a group in the community, how the applicants claim
Shireen, we
Oh,
can't.
we,
She's
we seem
frozen.
to have lost Shireen. I think
Yeah.
she was about to hand over to me, so I'll just
Go
pick
ahead.
up from there.
Yeah. Okay.
So really, what Shireen was about to say was that the case that the Dudu Baleni brought with members of her community is
relevant legislation to try and bring to visibilize what we think are unstated gender issues that are at stake. So I'm going to hand it over to Beth.
Thanks. So thanks, Shireen. You just froze there for a minute, but anyway, good that we have you back. So yes, so in this case that went to the Gauteng High Court, what we're trying to do, as Shireen was saying, is to actually excavate gender in the litigation. Our method is to say, let's look at the judgment, let's look at the supporting affidavits and the relevant legislation, and see if we can see some of the unstated gender issues in the case to try and comprehend this important and really significant judgment through a gender lens. So what the court was required to determine in this case was the interaction between the consent requirements of the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights, Informal Rights to Land Act, which affected the community's rights to their land, and the consultation requirements of the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, which also had some consultation requirements built in terms of government approval of mining applications. And the court concluded that by reading both acts together, the community must be allowed to reach a communal decision based on their custom regarding whether to consent to deprivation of their land. And it really was a very important interpretation of the law that firmly privileges decision-making by the affected community based on the Constitution's focus on advancing the rights of historically excluded people under apartheid. Now, the founding affidavit of Dudu Baleni attests to communitarian rights to land, the social and economic interdependence of the community, and what are called networks of support and mutual dependency in the sharing of food, resources, and labor. There are subtle references to gender differences. So she explains that the explanation of land allocation shows that while a male household head may be named as the person to whom land is allocated, women will still have use. It implies that male members may leave the area for paid labor elsewhere, but they don't relinquish entitlements to the land worked by the women who remain on it. And women who remain on the land provide the continuous care of land and property that supports the communities living there and those returning intermittently. And as Shireen has mentioned, this is a well-worn tale of gendered patterns of migrant labor in South Africa. But what is unusual in the case of this particular area is that the occupancy rights and decision-making powers of women in the Xolobeni community are stronger and more powerful than elsewhere in South Africa. Baleni's affidavit also references the history of the place and the different roles of men and women during the Pondo Revolt of the 1960s to resist attempts to relocate the community by an apartheid government betterment program. And she explains that in this war, all able-bodied men of the community took up arms, while women were supplying food, intelligence, and protection. While this indicates the long-standing resistance to enclosure of the land, it's further evidence of the different but equally important allocation of gender roles in the communal life of and in the defense of the commons. And the affidavit also documents the physical violence suffered by men and women in the community who have resisted the mine. Women have been fierce in their resistance and have been met with violence, as Shireen mentioned, which is also often seen in struggles to enclose commons all over the world. Boleni's affidavit captures the dangers that mining and destruction of the land and way of life poses to the community, and it suggests that the state services such as schools and clinics, though sparse, are essential to support the community alongside its own communal resources. And what the litigants fear is that the outside workers who come in for the mines will deplete these resources and put strain on the careful balance of communal subsistence. Their assumption is that the state will not step in to increase service provision in a province where government has been slow to improve the lives of its people. And they also worry, based on the experience of other mining affected communities, that an influx of workers will lead to damaging social impacts. The gendered impacts on mining affected communities are well documented within and outside of South Africa and are clearly known well to the Xolobeni community. So, as noted, the case was framed around land rights and community consent. The judgment responds well to this framing by asserting the centrality of the land to the reproduction of the community now and for future generations. And while this is an important victory, from a feminist climate justice perspective, the framing was limited. Neither the affidavit nor the judgment foreground gender and environmental rights sufficiently. And our rereading of the judgment is directed at highlighting the prefigurative aspects of the Xolobeni struggle as an exemplar in litigation dealing with environmental destruction and climate change, and to tease out the gender questions at stake. We use Margaret Davies' explanation of prefigurative theory as methodologies that are hopeful in the sense that they imagine and create at the same time as engage with and describe the world. In choosing a present in order to imagine a future, we consider how the Xolobeni struggle and the way of life it defends anticipates an ecologically sustainable and just social system built around social reproduction and production within the commons, and a legal framework that can recognize this as legitimate, desirable, and even exemplary. So the legal struggle is therefore prefigurative in terms of the politics of resistance, but also in terms of substantive conceptions of social and ecological ordering and new ways of understanding and using law. Just as law is often complicit in the harm of climate destruction, it might in some instances be mobilized both to remedy harm that's already occurred and also work to anticipate and prevent it. It may even, in the right conditions, support radical transformative conceptions of new social formations that require environmental remediation in a sustainable world. So Shireen mentioned Skosana and Koch, who argue that the struggles of women in mining affected communities are eco-feminist in practice, even if not explicitly articulated as such, and even when not part of how the women themselves understand their struggles or identify them. They point to three relevant ways in which eco-feminist concerns underlie these struggles. Firstly, their roles in social reproduction, especially in the gathering of food, energy, and water, the solidaristic and communal nature in which struggles are fought, and the respect for nature itself. Eco-feminists have noted the uneven impact of environmental degradation and climate destruction on women who perform much of the world's social reproductive work, itself dependent on natural resources. And as Mary Mellor explains, reproductive work, which is gendered, stands between the economy and the natural world, grappling with the consequences of ecological destruction. And Federici, who we mentioned, also argues that as the primary subjects of reproductive work, historically and in our time, women have depended on access to communal natural resources more than men and have been most penalized by their privatization and most committed to their defense. based on the idea that social reproduction is the work involved in creating and maintaining life. Threats to the communal land and environment of Xolobeni are intricately enmeshed in threats to the way of life of people in that community, particularly the women, and their capacity to reproduce themselves over time. Ellie Perkins notes that in the face of climate change, movements in the global south and north, largely led by women, are resisting ongoing enclosures for extraction and fossil fuel industries, and in the process, reclaiming commons. And Federici notes that not all struggles for the commons are successful, but the very fact that they are fought is important. They contain, as we show with that opening quote, that reinstatement of democratic politics, the renewal of voices at the grassroots, and the mobilization of ordinary people otherwise disabled by neoliberalism, as well as is the seeds for a different future. It's impossible, according to Federici, to defend existing communal rights without creating a new reality in the sense of new strategies, new alliances, and new forms of social organization. And we see legal strategies as part of these struggles, with a growing focus by eco-feminist lawyers to link environmental and climate justice to broader intersectional feminist and social justice movements. I'll stop there, but because I think we're out of time. But just to say that we obviously have left out a lot of the detail of the law and the story of this community. It's a very complex situation with a long history, but we see it in many ways as a very a hopeful example of the power of the grounded resistance in combination with the legal strategy to defend the feminist commons. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And the detail can be read in the paper, which we put the link to the open access version of the chapter, and the book itself, which is really a very, very interesting book, in the chat for people.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That is really riveting. Both the description of how you work in social reproduction, but also the litigation strategies. Just wondering if anyone has questions for Beth or Shireen. Well, I guess I'll start off. I guess just two questions. One was, I think early on, Shireen, you mentioned that this was a case that had sort of exposed differences within the community, in relation to the question. So I can easily think of, a section of the community that actually thinks that they might want a wage relationship, if not in the mining company, but somewhere else, in order to have some continuous means of income rather than relying on, natural resources. That is one question. The second question is about, I was just struck by how different, the idea of valuing natural resources, right? There are some parallels with how you value other immaterial labors of women, such as reproductive labor, paid and unpaid, and emotional labor, and so on and so forth. And obviously, one thinks about wages for and against housework, and in the context of the environment, I think is one of the other places where this kind of attempt to quantify has some attraction, whether it's potentially progressive and environmentalists, or even groups like I think, is it the Hank Paulson Foundation that has this whole thing about how do you put a price on, natural resources? I'm not sure. So how does it, I mean, I guess it speaks to also, is there something peculiar about women's labor where, the question of quantification becomes problematic, but in this context, somehow it becomes sort of easier? Thanks.
Do you want me to start, Beth?
Maybe you start about the wage labor, and I can talk about the quantification.
So, wage labor in South Africa there's a long and bleak history of it, right? Because from these areas, mining broke up families, divided, created all kinds of social disruptions, cultural disruptions, with and did bring in some money, but not enough. So there's a memory of that for the communities, right? At the same time, there are, of course, interests in wage labor. So there are people who say, well, I'll go and work I'll go and work on the mine. But the thing about this mine is that it was only going to offer 20 years worth. Right? After 20 years, it will have taken out all the titanium. And then what are you left with? And so, here you have a community that understands very well the value of the natural resources over the long term, which is that temporal quality we think is so important, versus the state, which has a sort of progress development, means wage work, means these things. Inside the community, the mining company was able to find an alliance through tactics that are very familiar all over the world. You bring a 4x4, you give it to the chief. You say, we'll build you a nice little house. We'll give you, you recruit the labor for us. So actually, some of the supporters of this creation of a mine were not the ones who were actually going to work in the mine, but they were going to extract some kind of rents out of allowing the mining company in on the basis that they represented the community. Other people within the community threw open that notion of representation completely and said, no, you don't represent us because you're getting certain benefits. We aren't. So for another group, they're trying to set up a vehicle through which they can also get benefits, right? And then there are the members of the community who don't want the mining at all. So this is, as always happens, not a simple story of the good community versus the bad company and the bad state. There's a complicated story here, but actually most of the women are united against this, and that may have something to do with the fact that women still don't feature even in rent seeking. In a sense, they're excluded from some of those networks. I did want to say one little other thing that we forgot to say earlier, Beth, and that is that in a way we go a long way with Silvia Federici on the commons, but because of these fights within the commons, these differences in power within the commons, which she also recognizes, right, that there's power in the commons, or what is considered to be the commons here between these different groups. We put a lot more emphasis on what we think can be gained from the fact that the South African Constitution is such a capacious and forward-looking document. We think that she thinks law can never be on the side of those defending the commons, and we wanted to use this to show you how, in a sense, it can, in certain moments, in certain ways.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, to add to that, I suppose also not to overly romanticize, I guess, the kind of impact of this case, because it could go on appeal. I mean, an appeal was threatened and it hasn't been pursued, and that may well be because of the strong resistance, not just the judgment, but and a range of other political issues that are going on around that. But yeah, I think we're not overly attributing the sort of power of law to succeed in these kind of battles, but a small space of hope. And there is something prefigurative, I guess, about the way the community is kind of portrayed and conceived in this litigation. But just on your point, Prabha, about the connections between commodification of the earth and social reproduction, which is a point that a number of the materialist ecofeminist scholars point to, that even calling them resources, even understanding, the things that the earth gives us as resources is a kind of market-driven thing. It's a commodification of nature, just in the way that social reproduction commodifies women's bodies and labor, in service of, of capitalism. And I suppose, yes, it's, that the connections between those are drawn out by ecofeminists because women are so central to defending that communal land and the commons, because of the very natural things that are needed to sustain communities. So I don't know if that quite addresses what you're asking, but there's a rich literature that explores that.
Okay, are there other questions for Beth and Shireen?
While people are thinking, I'll just say that there are enormous, this is a moment of enormous, well, I want to say it's like a critical juncture in South Africa around energy. And we have an energy crisis that stems out of policy failures and mismanagement and corruption, that in a weird sense also opens up the conversation to say, well, what is the long-term direction we want to go in, right? That is a larger, the larger climate and energy crises. The questions the space has opened up, ironically, because of various failures on the state side. So there's a big conversation that this is fitting into, and the outcomes are very, very unclear, because, of course, the mining companies have significant amount of power. There's not only in this case, it's a titanium mines interest, but the coal miners have a very strong interest in keeping the coal going, and are exerting various kinds of pressures. The company like MRC, which is a huge multinational, has tremendous power because it has already got mining rights in other parts of the world and in other countries. And so we're operating, putting pressure at that level too, not just on communities, but on people, on governments.
It's a question from Ruth.
So I'm trying to read it. Beth, do you want to do that rather than?
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. We wouldn't be making claims about law on its own being able to achieve change, and it's absolutely key that there's been such fierce resistance from this community. Law has just been one strategy, and we've actually seen further examples in the same community and nearby communities more recently, in a case against Shell, which was trying to what's it called, seismic surveys in the ocean of that very same coast. And again, you know, the court did manage to put a stop to those processes, but certainly there was enormous mobilization of the community and a range of different interests in the community, enormous media pressure, enormous sort of international focus on the issue. So yeah, certainly I would never, you know, see law working alone, but rather, you know, something that works when there's other forces at play to push back.
But I guess also, Ruth, what we're saying is that it's not only the law, right? Because the way in which the activists take their case, the way in which they frame their case is one version of what they think the law, how law can be used, and we're trying to say, hang on, if we were to use a feminist lens, might we expand this? Might we have more possibility? So even on how to use from the bottom up, how we use the law, I think what we need to have is a much broader conversation between feminist theory and law and politics and rights and activists who are, you know, skillfully trying to intervene and you know, to push for the way in which cases are framed to be more sensitive and articulate about the ways in which the structuring of gender relations shapes lives and livelihoods and so on. So kind of part of this is also that we need to try and create languages that can make that visible. And that's a political intervention.
Thank you. I guess I was also wondering whether you could say a little bit about the layering of laws in this context, because obviously the Constitution is very important, domestic law is very important, but there's often in these cases, given that these are international actors, I mean, what is the sort of international legal framework? And, you know, as one often finds with, say, labor or whatever, you know, it's a combination of labor standards, but also migration rules. So in the context of the environment, you know, do you have, you know, what is the sort of international legal framework that, you know, and which way it pushes in these kinds of struggles?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, that didn't really enter into it in terms of this particular case, because it was very much about interpreting national legislation. You know, yeah, there would certainly be other instances in environmental struggles, and, you know, where there are multinationals involved in mining applications, there would be cross-national issues, and international law might play a role. But in this case, it was, it was very much about the interpretation of legislation in line with the Constitution, which of course is informed by international human rights as well. But yeah, in this case, I think it was very much a kind of local decision.
Not in this particular, in the case we discussed, not some, you know, that's right. There were other cases associated with this struggle, like what the mining company tried to do was to use a sort of slap suit case to stop activists from educating communities about the impacts of the mining, right? Try to stop them from stop the normal democratic process, and which is a tactic that's been used in many parts of the world by companies using this tactic, and it was thrown out in South Africa. And I know that activists in other parts of the world were quite heartened by that and felt like that you know, could be something that they use a support when they are challenging the SLAPP suits in their jurisdictions.
But also maybe just to say that I think I mean, the fact that there was an overseas company involved is relevant, and I think kind of it's relevant to, in the origin country of the mining company in Australia, because it tells, sends a message to those companies about, the way their applications to mine in other countries are going to be received. And it kind of creates a precedent for other, activists around the world to try and sort of leverage that kind of argument against this kind of multinational extraction. So I think, in a sort of at a discursive level, at a sort of legal precedent level, there's something significant as well about these kind of actions succeeding where multinationals are involved. Certainly, but the Shell case, I think that's a significant blow to, their attempts to be able to just plunder Africa, which they are trying to, have done and are trying to continue to do in terms of new gas reserves, around the coast in South Africa, Mozambique, and elsewhere.
Are there any other questions at all, or comments? Any reflections?
With other forms of mining, where you had actual mining and unions, then what happens? How a company behaves in one jurisdiction has had significant impacts on how unions in other countries where the company operates can begin to mobilize, right? So we've seen that kind of transnational solidarity and activism and so on, and the kind of hold companies to account. Really very familiar with the steel workers in Canada, for example, who a very organized sector, and then the slightly less organized steel workers in Colombia, but both joined by global union processes, were able to engage in solidaristic strategies that would force the company's hand in ways that really helped Colombian workers. Just as an example. So I mean, that's a different kind of sense, because you do have unions. Here we are not, unions are not really an actor yet. They may well become so if the mining goes ahead, and be interesting to see. Yeah.
Yeah. Madhushri? Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. The talk was it was a fascinating talk. Thank you so much. It's really fascinating to see how you've incorporated the theories of ecofeminism and social reproduction and climate justice. So I was just I'm really looking forward to your to reading your paper. And so I was wondering, because I was reading about it a bit. So there was a lot of reports of environmental activists being killed by people. So is there any sort of state mechanisms in place to protect the community for now? Is there anything? I'm really curious to know. And another question I have, is there any intra-community conflict regarding this issue? It's just two questions that I have.
Do you want to address that, Cherie?
There are many intra-community conflicts, and we, Madhushri, if you read the paper, you'll get the more of that detail. There are divisions. I think that then it's hard. We don't know who was responsible for the deaths of activists because it never got prosecuted. It never got taken forward. Nobody's been arrested. What does that tell you? That tells you that the state's not really interested in protecting activists, really. So, on the ground, there are whispers about who it is that's responsible. Could be internal people inside the community who do want the development. They're very powerful interests for the mining because already we have seen in that community an influx of certain kinds of incentive structures, right, for the traditional leaders and the headmen and so on to get to agree to the mining. I don't see the state being ready to jump in to protect activists either here or in other parts of the country. There have been struggles in coal areas, and there around coal mining, which is highly unionized. Even the union wants to hold on to the coal mining, and so it's fighting environmental activists, right? So union is saying you want to take away our jobs. For what? For some long term, like what about the here and now? So it's not as if all communities in South Africa we can't generalize in a romantic way that, here when you have a commons and, you have this beautiful area where people can feed themselves through fishing and growing crops, they're going to have this great environmental sensibility. It's much more complicated than that, and politics and activism all play a part in shaping how communities respond. Sometimes they need to be convinced, right?
Sorry, and maybe just to add then, in terms of the international level around environmental defenders, interestingly, last year, the UN passed a resolution creating a right to a healthy environment. And it is the first time there's this environmental recognition at the international level. But what's interesting about the wording that was finally adopted and accepted by the General Assembly was that it was to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And when it had first been mooted, the word safe was also in that list. And that was to protect environmental defenders. And the resolution doesn't include the word safe. So it's interesting that a number of countries didn't want that included in that right. It's very much a terrain of fierce politics around the world. And yeah, certainly those deaths in the Xolobeni area are not unique. There are other parts of the country in South Africa where people have died defending their land from environmental devastation.
It's really great. I just wanted to come back to the question around quantification. So what really is at stake? Because presumably if it's not this area, right, the mining company may go to another country, or this problem is going to just be replicated wherever the titanium is. So what exactly are the stakes? I mean, how valuable is this titanium, like just in terms of a spreadsheet, like over the next 20 years, how much does this mining company expect to earn? And I know you mentioned that the feminists would say even talking about it in terms of resources is a commodifying move. But, just channeling Shireen here to talk about her idea of depletion, right? One of the strong points of this is to say, well, you might earn so much from this, but you are actually going to lose so much. And here is a price of the cost of depletion, and if you could actually quantify the effects on the community, and is that sort of a way of you're appropriating economic language, but as a way to ward off future claims on the environment in this way?
I mean, interestingly, that idea of depletion, and Shireen Ryan and I have talked about this, comes from environmental science. So it is actually the idea of depletion of natural resources. If we don't look after things sustainably, then they're going to run out. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening in the world. So, I mean, I suppose there is an argument that, you know, we can't just look at depletion of social reproduction through social reproduction in isolation from the rest of the natural world of which that social reproduction occurs. You know, if we don't protect these areas from, you know, environmental harm, there's going to be nothing left to sustain us and support us. I mean, yes, at the same time, I guess there are strong arguments by these, you know, by people in some of these communities to say, you know, the world has got to find, you know, use some of its mineral resources to, you know, make stuff and support us, and that, you know, that will actually be needed. But I think we have to, you know, we have to actually question those decisions. We have to question what sustainability actually means.
So the environmental activists here did try to address that quantification, beneficiation question, and their estimate, as well as I think the company's estimate, I think something like, I thought it was 300 jobs that would be created for a period of 20 years. So it would create some jobs. And then in 20 years, in the activist quantification of the costs of this versus the benefits, they're saying, well, you know, we'll have they'll employ 300 people, I'm sure is the figure I saw. Some of those will come from outside the area. They will leave after 20 years. So that's less than one generation almost, you know, the job benefit. And that's really why the SLAP suit was attempted, because the environmental activists were showing how little the benefit actually would be to that community. To the state, there's a benefit because it would extract taxes and so on, right? That would go to the national state. But the cost-benefit analysis here is, I guess, weak enough that it sustained the activism. You could counter it a little more easily. Would that be the case where there's a much greater industrial, say, operation, you know, where there's many more jobs that would be created, where, yeah, that would be perhaps, and we see that in the coal mining areas where we've historically had coal mines, that people want to hang on to those jobs. It's the same in Canada, you know, in the oil fields, people want to hang on to, they don't want to shift. The policy shifts for the Trudeau government's climate change commitments to be enacted, because they want to hold on to the old oil jobs, which they feel provides pretty good living actually for the oil sector, wealth producing sector. I think then the issues become more complicated, harder, you know, harder to challenge.
Yeah.
Right. And the profits to the companies are presumably multiples of what they're, or they don't reveal it. Do they even reveal it?
They don't reveal what the profits are now.
Yeah.
But the jobs, they have tried to quantify how many jobs they'll create. And obviously it's a small area, not many people living there. So they will have to bring in external labor. That's and like Beth and I, we skated over that question, but obviously, you know, the community is also wanting to be a closed community. That's a problematic thing, you know, with these outsiders going to come and destroy the fabric of our society, which is potentially, you know, very problematic, democratically speaking.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I just wondered if there's a vocabulary for saying the loss of fishing would amount to this much, or the loss of, you know, the environment, the culture, you know, if you could actually put a tag on all of that, because that's really where we have issues with, how do you quantify women's labor, right? When someone says, oh, it's
Mhm.
worth
Yeah.
$12 trillion, then it makes such an immediate case for how much, women are actually contributing to the GDP. So I was just curious about that, but that's really useful. Yeah, thank you. I realize it's getting late for you, Beth. So, I just want to thank you. Unless there are any final questions for Shireen and Beth. So, well, thank you very much. And really, we're looking forward to engaging with the volume, which seems like it's carving out a new space for discussing, reproductive labor and climate justice. So, thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.